I stood near the altar, the jade green silk of my bridesmaid dress whispering softly as I shifted my weight. Just before the heavy church doors were swung open, Rachel, my dearest friend since kindergarten, made a minute adjustment to the delicate lace that cascaded down her wedding gown. She was breathtaking, radiant. There was a light that emanated from her, a pure joy that made my chest ache with a feeling that was difficult to decipher. It wasn't jealousy. It was something far more complicated, inextricably tied to my own broken reality. It had been 3 months. 3 months since I woke up in that sterile hospital room. The world a blurry watercolor of white walls and hushed voices. 3 months since I woke with empty arms. A hollow space in my chest where Lily should have been, and the nurse's strange, almost pitying, glance that told me everything I didn't want to know. 3 months of navigating a world that continued its relentless spin, oblivious to the fact that mine had ground to a complete, unceremonious halt. Are you okay? Rachel's voice was a gentle balm, soft and laced with concern. Her hand found mine, a comforting squeeze that was both grounding and a stark reminder of the life I was supposed to be living, the one that wasn't steeped in grief and loss. That touch pulled me back from the precipice, lifting me away from the dark, seductive edge I had learned to drift toward in those long, sleepless nights. I'm fine, I lied, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I gave her hand a small, reassuring squeeze in return, hoping I could project the image of strength I so desperately wanted to possess. Today is your day, Ratch. I won't ruin it because of my grief. Her eyes, brimming with unshed tears, softened even further. You're not ruining anything, Claire. Having you here, standing beside me, means more to me than you know. Before I could muster a response, the music swelled, the first notes of the familiar wedding march filling the church with an almost tangible sense of anticipation. James stood at the front, a picture of nervous joy, his face glowing as he watched his bride prepare to walk toward him and begin their life together. I stepped into place beside the other bridesmaids, forcing a smile, trying to be present for Rachel, for my best friend. Even though every cell in my body screamed for escape, wanted to be anywhere else but here, surrounded by the symbols of a life I had been so cruelly denied, I plastered on that smile. The church was bathed in a soft, ethereal light. Bouquets of white and pale blue hydrangeas, tied with delicate silk ribbons, lined the aisle, their gentle fragrance a poignant reminder of spring, of new beginnings. But inside me, everything was a dull, hollow blur, a landscape of muted colors and echoing silence. My gaze drifted towards the back of the church, landing on a tiny infant cradled in someone's arms in a back pew. She looked just a few months old, wrapped in a cream-colored blanket, her tiny fist curled loosely against her cheek. My heart clenched like a fist in response, a sharp, agonizing twist that stole my breath. I turned away, swallowing hard, desperately fighting to keep the rising tide of tears at bay. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was a raw, visceral pain, vivid and unrelenting, needing no permission to return, no invitation to consume me. 3 months. 3 months was long enough for people to forget the intensity of your pain, long enough for them to hope you had moved on. A phrase that felt like a physical blow, long enough for them to ask, with well-meaning but agonizing ignorance, are you feeling better? But not long enough for me to stop remembering the feel of Lily's weight in my arms. Not long enough to forget the way her tiny fingers would grip mine. Not long enough to forget the sweet, milky scent of her skin. Not long enough to forget the devastating emptiness of empty arms. The minister's voice startled me, dragging me back to the present moment. I forced myself to focus, clinging to every vow Rachel spoke, each soft laugh she shared with James, every loving glance exchanged at the altar. Everyone else was touched, moved by the ceremony. I was supposed to be too, but the truth was, I was simply holding myself together, a fragile construct of forced smiles and shallow breaths, teetering on the edge of collapse. Then a baby's cry pierced the quiet sanctuary, shattering the fragile peace. It wasn't a simple cry of hunger or discomfort. It was sharp, insistent, cutting through the air with a desperate pleading, a profound confusion, and an almost unbearable despair. In that instant, something shifted within me, a primal instinct, a surge of memory, something ancient and visceral. Whatever was left of me after the loss of Lily rose up all at once, demanding attention, demanding action. The baby cried again, louder this time, a sharp wail that echoed off the vaulted ceiling, amplified by the oppressive silence. The guests began to whisper, a ripple of unease spreading through the pews. A man, looking mortified and desperate, abruptly stood up. He clearly didn't want to ruin the ceremony, didn't want to be the cause of disruption on this sacred day. Clutching the screaming infant tight to his chest, he turned and hurriedly strode toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the church, the nanny rushing to follow him, her face etched with worry. I watched him go, and a physical ache slammed into my chest. It was a complicated sensation, a mixture of things. A twinge of the engorgement I felt because I needed to express milk, a profound and inexplicable pull towards that tiny, distressed life, and a wave of grief so intense it threatened to drown me. Without thinking, without considering protocol or social expectations, I stepped out of the bridesmaid line. I caught Rachel's eye. She gave me a tiny, confused nod, her brow furrowed with concern, as if sensing, somehow, that I had to go, that something beyond the ordinary was compelling me forward. I lifted my skirts and hurried down the aisle, pushing through the heavy doors into the quiet, empty vestibule. In the dim light of the vestibule, the sound of the baby's cries was deafening, a raw, piercing sound that resonated deep within my bones. The man, who I would soon learn was named Graham, was pacing back and forth, bouncing her frantically, sweat beading on his forehead. Excuse me, I said, my voice breathless, barely a whisper above the baby's wails. He spun around, startled to see a bridesmaid standing there. I'm so sorry, he rasped, his voice thick with anxiety. I'm trying to get her to stop. I'll just take her to the car. No, I interrupted gently, stepping closer, drawn by an invisible force. Let me help. I have milk. He froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. The nanny gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. I saw the skepticism warring with desperation in his eyes, a flicker of hope battling with the ingrained instinct to protect his child. Please, I whispered, pressing a hand to my aching chest, the milk ducts throbbing with painful fullness. I lost my daughter 3 months ago, but I've been pumping daily to donate to the hospital. I missed my session today. I'm in pain and she is clearly hungry. Please just let me feed her. He looked at me, really looked at me, saw past the jade green dress and the forced smile, saw the raw grief etched on my face, saw the unwavering sincerity in my eyes, and he saw the truth. Slowly, hesitantly, he handed Izzy over. I sat on a velvet bench in the corner, shielded from the glass doors that led back into the church, and quickly adjusted my dress. The moment the baby's lips touched my skin, the crying stopped almost instantly. She hiccuped once, a tiny, fragile sound, then began to suck slowly, cautiously, as if she couldn't quite believe she had truly found what she needed, what she had been desperately crying out for. I held her closer, leaning back slightly, instinctively cradling her against my chest. The sounds of the church, the muffled music and the hushed voices, blurred into nothingness, fading into a distant hum. I heard only her breathing, the soft rhythmic swallow, the tiny movements of her hand gripping the fabric of my dress as if it were a lifeline. A tear escaped my eye, tracing a warm path down my cheek and onto my collarbone. I didn't know if it was mine or hers, a shared drop of sorrow and relief, maybe both. The man stood frozen, staring as though he couldn't quite comprehend what he was witnessing, as if he had stumbled into a scene from a dream. The nanny all but held her breath, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. I looked up and asked softly, "What's her name?" He answered in a low, rough voice, a voice strained with emotion. "Isabel, but I call her Izzy. Izzy." I looked down at the little girl nursing peacefully, her hand still clutching me as if she had known me forever, as if she recognized something familiar and comforting in my touch. My heart ached, not just with the pain of losing Lily, but because, for the first time in 3 months, I felt alive. Not just existing, not just enduring, but truly connected to another soul, forging a bond that transcended logic and reason, something that felt strangely, undeniably like fate. The feeling of a child nursing from your body is something that defies description, something that has no name. It is not only instinct, but a sacred connection that rises above pain and reason, a primal exchange of sustenance and comfort, a merging of two souls in a moment of profound intimacy. I sat still, holding Izzy close against my chest, my hand stroking her tiny back in a soothing rhythm. The tension inside her small body gradually loosened, her limbs relaxing, her breathing becoming deeper and more regular. She let out a soft breath, a sigh of contentment, as if releasing some invisible burden she had been carrying since the moment she was born. The silence in the vestibule was sudden and absolute. The frantic screaming was replaced by the soft, rhythmic sound of breathing and swallowing, a lullaby of life and connection. Graham slumped against the wall opposite me, sliding down until he was crouching, running a hand over his face as if releasing a breath he'd held for months, perhaps even years. Through the glass panels of the double doors, I could see the ceremony continuing inside, the figures moving like actors on a distant stage, the sounds muffled and indistinct. But out here, in this quiet shadow, in this liminal space between two worlds, it felt like the three of us were the only people in the world, bound together by an invisible thread of shared sorrow and unexpected grace. I looked down at Izzy, now peaceful and content, and for the first time in months, the hollow ache in my heart began to fill, a tiny flicker of warmth igniting in the darkness. Izzy kept nursing steadily, her small hand resting on my chest, gripping gently with each rhythm. Graham, the man whose name I had only learned through the nanny's whisper, stood nearby without taking his eyes off his daughter, his gaze fixed on the two of us with an intensity that made my skin prickle. His posture remained unchanged, broad shoulders and straight back, the stance of a man accustomed to control, but his eyes were different. The cold, hardened expression he had worn earlier had softened, replaced by a look of profound confusion and something that felt like gratitude, a vulnerability he clearly wasn't used to displaying. I had never seen an expression quite like that in my life. When the ceremony ended and the guests began making their way outside to congratulate the couple, Rachel came toward me, her eyes searching, her expression a mixture of concern and understanding. She bent down and kissed Izzy lightly on the forehead before whispering, "You just did something extraordinary, Claire." I gave a small nod, my throat tightening, overwhelmed by a wave of emotion. Not because someone had praised me, but because, for the first time in months, I felt something inside me begin to heal, a tiny crack appearing in the wall of grief that had surrounded my heart for so long. A tiny sob escaped from Izzy, and I looked down, instinctively tightening my hold on her. She had fallen asleep, her lips still gently pursed, as though she didn't want to let go of the newfound safety and comfort she had just discovered. Graham stepped closer, stopping beside me, his presence suddenly looming large. I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice low and rough, the kind of voice used more often for commands than for expressions of gratitude. "You don't need to say anything," I replied softly, my eyes still fixed on Izzy's peaceful face. "I just did what my heart told me to do." He nodded, looking down at us with a heavy, contemplative gaze, his thoughts swirling beneath the surface. "What you said inside, about losing your daughter, and donating milk?" He paused, swallowing hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "I am deeply sorry for your loss, and I am incredibly grateful that you were here today." I looked up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time without flinching. His silence wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was respectful, a deep quiet that held space for both our sorrows, a shared understanding that transcended words. "Izzy never takes a bottle," he said after a moment, his eyes fixed on his daughter, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're the first person who's ever gotten her to eat." I didn't know what to say to that, so I simply held the sleeping child a little closer, pressing a kiss to her soft, downy hair. In that moment, I knew something had shifted, something profound and irreversible. Not just for Izzy, but for me and for the stranger standing beside me, his heart as wounded as my own. An invisible thread had just been tied, a fragile connection forged in the crucible of grief and unexpected grace. And though none of us said it aloud, we all knew this wasn't where the story would end. After all the guests had left the church and only close friends remained to tidy up, I stayed seated on the velvet bench, holding Izzy in my arms, reluctant to break the spell that had fallen over us. She was still asleep, deeply and peacefully, her gentle breaths warming the side of my neck, a tangible reminder of the life I had so unexpectedly touched. Part of me wanted to stay like that forever, cocooned in this quiet sanctuary, shielded from the harsh realities of the world outside. Another part, the cautious, practical part, reminded me that I needed to stand up, return her to her father, and go back to my own sorrow, back to the empty house and the silent nights. But I didn't move and Graham didn't leave. He stood there quietly, hands tucked in his pockets, his eyes drifting through 1,000 unspoken thoughts, his expression unreadable. After a long while, he stepped closer and stopped in front of me, his presence filling the small space. I know this might sound strange, he began, his voice steady, though something raw trembled beneath it, a vulnerability he couldn't quite conceal. But I need your help. I lifted my head to look at him, frowning slightly, unsure of what to expect. I can pay you whatever rate you want, he continued, still staring at Izzy, his gaze fixed on her tiny, sleeping face. Just stay with her for a few days, help her eat, sleep, and calm down. My initial instinct was to refuse, to say no, to tell him this was too sudden, too overwhelming, that I wasn't used to working for someone I barely knew, that I wasn't ready to be close to a child again, not after Lily. But then I looked down at the tiny face sleeping against my chest, at the peaceful expression that had replaced the earlier terror. Something inside me tightened. A protective instinct I thought had died with my daughter. A thread, delicate but undeniable, tugged at my heart. I'm not a nanny, I said softly, not as a rejection, but as a gentle boundary, a reminder that I was still grappling with my own grief. I know, he replied without the slightest offense, his voice laced with a quiet desperation. But you're the only one who soothed her. Since my wife died, Izzy has never slept like this. She never eats like a normal baby. I've tried everything. Doctors, specialists, nannies. No one has done what you did in just minutes. I swallowed hard as a nameless emotion welled up inside me. A potent mixture of sorrow, empathy, and a flicker of hope. His loss collided with mine, forming a quiet, wordless bond neither of us needed to explain. A shared understanding that transcended the need for elaborate explanations. Just a few days, he repeated, gentler this time, almost pleading. I'll set up a private room for you in my home. Everything you need will be there. If after a few days you feel uncomfortable, you can leave. No questions asked. I didn't answer right away, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I thought of Lily, of the nights I lay alone, clutching a cold pillow, wishing I could feed my child just once more, wishing I could feel the weight of her body against mine again. I thought of the completeness I had felt moments ago when Izzy pressed her cheek against me, as if she too were searching for something she had lost, something only a mother could provide. 2 weeks, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. I'll stay for 2 weeks, no more. Graham nodded, his face still serious, but a flicker of relief flickered unmistakably in his eyes. 2 weeks, he repeated, as if solidifying the agreement. That's enough. I stood up carefully, cradling Izzy still in my arms, her small body limp and trusting against mine. And for the first time since losing Lily, I didn't feel like I was walking against everything inside myself, fighting a constant battle against the tide of grief. I felt like I was stepping towards something new, something uncertain but undeniably compelling. Not to replace what I had lost, but to begin again, to find a new purpose in the wreckage of my shattered world. And though my mind remained cautious, my heart knew something larger was taking shape, a possibility I couldn't ignore, a chance, a connection, a path I never imagined I'd be willing to follow. But now, maybe, just maybe, I was ready. I arrived at Graham's apartment the next afternoon, carrying a small suitcase filled with a few simple outfits and a handful of old books I wasn't sure I had the focus to read. The car that picked me up at my modest apartment stopped before a skyscraper in the heart of Boston, its sleek glass facade shimmering under the late afternoon sun, reflecting the city's skyline like a distorted mirror. Stepping into the lobby felt like entering a different world entirely, a realm of curated perfection and hushed elegance. Everything was too perfect, too clean, too quiet. Cool air from the ventilation system brushed through my coat, making me shiver, a physical manifestation of the emotional chill that permeated the space. The receptionist, a woman in a dark, impeccably tailored uniform, greeted me with a polite but impersonal smile, then quickly escorted me to the top floor in a silent, high-speed elevator. The penthouse opened before me like a photograph from an interior design magazine, a carefully constructed tableau of wealth and sophistication. Polished wooden floors gleamed under the recessed lighting, walls of glass stretched from floor to ceiling offering panoramic views of the city, and natural light poured into every corner, illuminating the stark, minimalist decor. Each piece of furniture sat precisely in place, arranged with almost mechanical precision. Nothing extra, nothing out of place, nothing warm or inviting. Graham waited near the window, silhouetted against the city skyline, holding a steaming espresso cup in his hand. He wore a crisp white shirt and impeccably tailored black dress pants, standing with the posture of someone who had never allowed himself the luxury of weariness, someone who carried the weight of the world on his broad shoulders without ever faltering. When he saw me enter, he simply nodded, a curt acknowledgement of my arrival, and turned to lead me through the expansive living area. My footsteps echoed softly against the polished floor, the only sound in the vast, hushed space, a stark contrast to the cacophony of emotions swirling within me. Graham guided me to a small room at the far corner of the apartment, a space that felt strangely isolated from the rest of the pristine interior. It had a large window facing south, overlooking the harbor, where small white boats drifted across the gray-blue water, their sails billowing in the gentle breeze. The bed was neatly made, the crisp white linens pulled taut, towels were folded with meticulous precision on the bathroom counter, and a vase of pale blue hydrangeas sat on the desk, their delicate petals a splash of color in the otherwise monochrome room. A thoughtful arrangement, yet still distant, as if meant to be polite but not intimate, a gesture of hospitality rather than a genuine welcome. If you need anything, ask Elena, Graham said from behind me, his voice low and devoid of emotion. She's the housekeeper. She'll handle everything. I nodded, setting my suitcase down by the bed, the weight of it a physical reminder of the life I had left behind, the life I was trying to piece back together. Is Izzy sleeping? Yes, he replied, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. She finally ate normally this morning. Not much, but it's the first time she didn't scream in someone's arms. I turned to look at him, searching his face for any sign of vulnerability, any hint of the man I had seen in the church vestibule. His eyes stayed fixed on the window, his expression unreadable, as though his thoughts were far away, lost in a labyrinth of memories and unspoken grief. Thank you for coming, he said quietly after a long moment, his voice barely above a whisper. I know this isn't easy. No, I replied softly but firmly, meeting his gaze with unwavering sincerity. It's not, but I think I need this. He didn't ask why, didn't pry into my motivations. Maybe he understood that everyone carries a private grief, a burden too heavy to share. Maybe he recognized in me a kindred spirit, someone who understood the language of loss without needing to speak the words aloud. Maybe he simply didn't care, content to accept my help without delving too deeply into the complexities of my shattered life. After he left the room, closing the door softly behind him, I opened my suitcase, took out a small photograph of Lily, and placed it on the bedside table, the only picture I had brought with me, the only piece of my old life I dared to carry into the sterile new world. She was asleep in it, her face peaceful and serene in a way that broke my heart all over again, a reminder of the innocence and joy that had been so cruelly stolen from me. I sat on the edge of the bed and drew a long, shaky breath, trying to compose myself, trying to steel myself for the challenges that lay ahead. There were no children's toys here, no laughter, no scent of milk, no gentle chaos of family life, only the steady hum of the air conditioner and a quiet so complete it almost felt heavy, a suffocating silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. This was where Graham and Izzy lived, a place full enough to impress, but empty enough to ache, a gilded cage built on a foundation of grief and isolation. I didn't know what I could do in the next 2 weeks, what impact I could possibly have on these two wounded souls, but I knew I would begin by making this place a little less cold, a little less sterile, a little more like a home. Just a little, and maybe that would be enough. The first morning in Graham's apartment began with a raw, raspy cry echoing from the room next door, a sound that shattered the fragile peace of the early morning hours and sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. I got up quickly, pulled on a light robe, and hurried to Izzy's room, my heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and a fierce determination to soothe the distressed child. The nursery looked like something out of a baby magazine, a meticulously designed space filled with soft, neutral tones, plush carpets, and neatly arranged wooden toys on the shelves, a testament to Graham's desire to provide the best for his daughter. But Izzy cared about none of it. Her face was flushed red, her tiny hands flailing wildly in the air, her eyes wide with panic and a primal fear, and the sound coming from her wasn't the cry of an ordinary child. It was the sound of a baby pushed to her limits, a tiny soul who seemed to believe the world had never been safe, and she had to fight it every waking moment, every breath a struggle against an unseen enemy. I leaned down and gently lifted her into my arms, holding her close and rocking her gently, instinctively drawing on the skills I had honed during my brief, precious time with Lily. She flinched at first, her body stiffening with resistance. Then, as if recognizing something familiar and comforting in my touch, she pressed her face into my neck, her cries softening into broken little hiccups, a heartbreaking sound that resonated deep within my soul. I felt each rapid breath, each trembling shudder along her small shoulders, the desperate clinging of her tiny hands. This wasn't hunger. It wasn't discomfort. It wasn't colic, the catch-all diagnosis doctors often used when they couldn't pinpoint the cause of a baby's distress. This was fear, a deep-seated primal fear that had taken root in her tiny heart, a fear rooted somewhere deep in her earliest days, likely sown in the absence of a mother's warmth, nurtured by the constant sense of unease that permeated her young life. I carried Izzy back to my room, away from the sterile perfection of the nursery, and pulled open the curtains to let the early morning light spill across the glass, illuminating the space with a soft, golden glow. Then, I sat down in the rocking chair by the window, the gentle swaying motion a soothing balm for both of us. I settled her in my lap, adjusted my shirt, and guided her to nurse, offering her the comfort and nourishment she so desperately craved. She hesitated for a few seconds, her body tense with apprehension, then latched on as if it were the only place she had ever truly felt safe, the only source of solace in a world that had offered her so little comfort. When she finished, her body limp and relaxed, I burped her gently and hummed a soft lullaby, the same one my own mother had sung to me, the same one I had sung to Lily. Izzy drifted off to sleep, her small hands still clutching the corner of my shirt as though afraid I might disappear, afraid of being left alone in the darkness once more. After laying her down carefully in the crib, I washed my hands and opened the notebook I had brought with me, a simple bound journal filled with blank pages. I began jotting down everything I had observed, every nuance of Izzy's behavior, every clue to the root of her distress. I had read countless materials about newborns, learning how to care for Lily with the mixture of love and anxious devotion only a new mother knows. And now, those same instinctive tools had become a quiet kind of armor, something that allowed me to understand Izzy in ways no one else could, to decipher the unspoken language of her cries and anticipate her needs before she even voiced them. Over the next 3 days, I kept a steady, predictable routine for her, creating a sense of stability and security in her chaotic world. Regular feeding times, consistent nap times, gentle bath times, times where I simply held her with no agenda other than to let her feel someone's warm presence, to reassure her that she wasn't alone. Every time she startled, cried, or rejected the bottle, I didn't force her. I stepped back, giving her space, allowing her to regain her composure at her own pace. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to unravel the tangled knot of her anxieties, peeling back the layers of fear that had encrusted her heart. But as I observed her more closely, I began to notice something deeply troubling, something that went beyond simple anxiety. Izzy's body was much smaller than it should have been for her actual age, her limbs thin and fragile, her movements lacking the energy and coordination of a typical infant. Her muscles were soft, her reflexes slow, and her ability to focus was almost non-existent. Any loud noise or unfamiliar person sent her into immediate panic, her head whipping around in search of somewhere to hide, her eyes wide with terror. None of it was normal, none of it aligned with the expected developmental milestones for a child her age. Driven by a growing sense of unease, I began going through the medical reports stored in the filing cabinet near the living room, a sleek, modern piece of furniture that seemed out of place in a home that should have been filled with colorful toys and children's books. Graham hadn't hidden a thing, leaving everything out in the open, perhaps out of a misplaced sense of trust, or perhaps simply because he didn't know what to look for. Every medical record was neatly kept, meticulously organized, detailing each developmental milestone and every doctor's visit, and all of it pointed to the same disturbing conclusion. Izzy was developmentally delayed due to chronic stress, a condition that had stunted her growth and hindered her ability to thrive. She wasn't lacking milk. She wasn't lacking doctors. She wasn't lacking meticulous care. She was lacking the most essential thing a child needs: safety, security, and the unwavering love of a nurturing caregiver. I closed the folder, my hands trembling, and sat there for a long time, staring blankly at the wall, my heart heavy with a profound sense of sadness and outrage. Children can't tell us what they need, can't articulate their fears and anxieties. They only know how to cry, to express their distress in the only way they know how. And when no one understands, when their cries go unanswered, they cry until silence becomes the only shield they have left, a protective barrier against a world that feels too overwhelming, too frightening, too unpredictable. Graham returned late that evening, later than usual, his face etched with weariness, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He walked in, hung his coat on the hook near the door with a sigh, and quietly looked at me, holding Izzy in my arms, her body limp and relaxed, freshly asleep after a long, soothing nursing session. I lifted my head, meeting his tired gaze with unwavering resolve, and said gently without rehearsal, the words tumbling out of my mouth as if guided by an unseen force. She doesn't need more doctors, Graham. She needs a mother. Graham didn't respond right away. His eyes dimmed slightly, as though something inside him had cracked open, exposing a raw vulnerability he usually kept hidden behind a wall of stoicism and control. The weight of my words settled heavily in the air between us, a challenge he couldn't ignore. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't just Izzy beginning to heal. It was him too. Graham started coming home earlier, subtly shifting his priorities, rearranging his schedule to spend more time with Izzy, to be present in her life in a way he hadn't been before. No one said it aloud, but I saw it clearly in his actions, in the way he lingered near the nursery, listening to her gentle breathing, in the way he watched me care for her with a mixture of gratitude and quiet observation. Meetings were shortened, phone calls were taken in private, and his phone no longer buzzed endlessly when he walked through the door, demanding his attention. He ate more dinners at the kitchen counter with me and Izzy than alone in his office, savoring the simple act of sharing a meal, even if his portion was cold and his conversation limited to the occasional smile and nod. At first, he watched from a distance, observing me care for his daughter with a mixture of gratitude and caution, as if he were afraid of getting too close, afraid of disrupting the delicate balance we were beginning to create. But then, slowly, hesitantly, he began asking questions, tentatively reaching out to understand the methods behind my seemingly effortless care. Not the controlling or doubtful kind of questions, but questions born from a genuine desire to learn, to connect, to be a better father. Why do you rock her with that light tapping rhythm? He asked one afternoon as I sat in the rocking chair, Izzy curled against my chest, her body completely relaxed, her eyes closed in peaceful slumber. Because it mimics the sensation she felt in the womb, I said, my voice soft, still watching Izzy's peaceful little face, her tiny lips pursed in a gentle suckling motion. It tells her everything is familiar and safe, predictable and comforting. It reminds her of the world she knew before she was born. He nodded, absorbing the information, asking nothing more. But that evening, I saw him trying the exact same motion while holding Izzy as I prepared a bottle in the kitchen. His movements awkward and hesitant, his brow furrowed in concentration. His hands were a little clumsy, his rhythm uneven, but Izzy didn't cry. She simply gazed up at him with wide, trusting eyes, her small hand reaching out to grasp his finger. I stood in the doorway, silent and unobserved, just watching the broad silhouette of a man gently rocking his child, repeating the same lullaby I had hummed hours earlier, his voice a low, soothing murmur. It was a poignant scene, a testament to the transformative power of love and the unwavering desire of a father to connect with his child, to heal the wounds of the past and build a brighter future. Another night, while I was making tea in the kitchen, the gentle clinking of cups the only sound in the quiet apartment, he walked in, sleeves rolled up, a trace of weariness in his eyes, a sign that he was finally allowing himself to feel the weight of his responsibilities. Do you think keeping the environment too quiet might be making her more jumpy? He asked, his voice thoughtful, as if he had been pondering the question all day, turning it over in his mind, searching for an answer. I set the tea down, surprised by his insight, touched by his willingness to learn. Did you read something about that? No, he said, pouring himself a cup of hot water, his movements slow and deliberate. I just noticed that anytime someone drops something or a door closes too sharply, she curls in on herself, like she's trying to disappear. I smiled, a genuine smile that reached my eyes, a sign that the ice around my heart was slowly beginning to thaw. You're right. Babies need to hear ordinary sounds to learn which noises matter and which don't. If the environment is too quiet, every little change feels like a threat, a potential danger lurking in the shadows. Graham sat across from me at the kitchen table, his gaze no longer cold and distant, but warm and engaged, as if he were finally seeing me, truly seeing me, for the first time. In that moment, he wasn't a powerful man living in a pristine penthouse, a titan of industry accustomed to giving orders and demanding results. He was a father, a vulnerable, fallible human being, learning everything from the beginning, step by careful step, with as much sincerity and dedication as he could muster. In the evenings that followed, he began helping me read bedtime stories to Izzy, transforming the sterile nursery into a cozy haven of laughter and imagination. At first, his voice was stiff and awkward, the words catching clumsily in his throat, as if he were reading a legal document rather than a children's book. But gradually, he relaxed, shedding his inhibitions, and I saw a softness in his eyes every time Izzy reached for his finger during the story's most dramatic moments, a connection forming between them, a bond that transcended words. One night after Izzy was asleep, her small body tucked safely in her crib, I picked up her toys in the living room, restoring the space to its usual pristine order, while he stood at the window, gazing out at the city lights shimmering below, a vast expanse of glittering buildings stretching as far as the eye could see. Do you think she can overcome this? He asked, his voice low but tinged with a fragility I hadn't heard before. Do you think she can heal from all of this? Yes, I answered without hesitation, my voice filled with conviction, but not with milk or medicine alone, not with fancy toys or expensive therapies. She'll need love, Graham. She'll need patience, consistency, and your unwavering presence in her life. She'll need to know that you will always be there to protect her, to comfort her, to guide her through the darkness and into the light. He turned to look at me, and this time his gaze wasn't analytical nor guarded, but searching, vulnerable, and profoundly grateful. It was listening, truly listening, absorbing every word I said, committing them to memory, understanding the weight of their meaning. In the days I spent living with Graham and Izzy, I came to understand that the distance between us wasn't built from differences too vast to cross, but from wounds neither of us had yet named, scars that had hardened over time, creating a barrier of pain and mistrust. And as he slowly let me step into his quiet world with his small questions, brief confessions, and, over steaming cups of tea, the silent air between us, once thick with tension, had evolved into something profound, a quiet understanding that transcended the need for words. I traced the rim of my delicate porcelain cup, the faint glow of the kitchen lights dancing on the cool granite surface. Across from me, Graham sat in thoughtful silence, a stark contrast to the guarded posture he once held. His gaze held a hesitant invitation, a willingness to listen, to stay, if I dared to speak. Taking a deep breath, I plunged into the silence. I used to have a daughter, I whispered, the words barely audible, yet he heard. His head lifted, his gray eyes softening with an empathy I hadn't witnessed before. Her name was Lily, I continued, my gaze fixed on the wisps of steam that curled around the cup. She arrived a little early, a tiny thing but healthy. I envisioned a lifetime of motherhood. I had everything planned. A crib painted a soft yellow, hand-knitted blankets, even the charming little preschool near the park that I adored. My voice faltered, my throat tightening as a memory resurfaced, vivid and painful as if it were yesterday. Then one night, an excruciating pain seized me, the frantic rush to the hospital, then a blur of faces, procedures, the harsh glare of sterile lights. I awoke to emptiness, no one to hold me, no baby's cry to fill the silence, only a nurse offering hollow apologies, her eyes unable to meet mine. Graham remained silent, but his hand tightened around his own cup, his thumb rubbing circles along its edge, a subtle display of shared pain. I finally met his gaze. I was utterly alone. My parents had passed away years ago. Lily's father vanished the moment he learned I was pregnant. I gave birth to a child, only to lose her before I even had the chance to whisper her name. Still, he didn't speak, but his eyes, once steely and controlled, now reflected the profound understanding of loss. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice low and strained. Julia didn't want to be a mother. The words were clipped, sharp, like the edge of a blade. She discovered she was pregnant with Izzy, just as she was about to sign a lucrative contract with a European cosmetics giant. I believed she would choose our family, but she chose to leave. There were no arguments, no anger. She simply walked away. He averted his gaze, looking out at the city lights blurring beyond the window. I don't blame her, he murmured, but the words felt hollow. I thought I understood, but when I held Izzy for the first time, I realized I was completely unprepared. I had money, power, a team of people ready to assist me, but I lacked the innate knowledge, the overwhelming love that fatherhood demanded. Not until you walked in. He broke off, unable or unwilling to continue. My heart sank. I'm not good with children, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to hold her correctly, how to interpret her cries, why she looks at me as if I'm a stranger. Because you are a stranger, I whispered. But that doesn't mean you can't change. He looked back at me, without offense or defensiveness, just a quiet acknowledgement, quietly weary from carrying a burden he hadn't been taught to bear. And in that instant, two souls seemingly worlds apart, separated by status, circumstance, and past traumas, found common ground in the shared ache of loss and the yearning for a fresh start. Not to replace what was gone, but to rebuild, to restore. An intangible connection drifted between us, nameless and pure, a mutual understanding I had never experienced before, and perhaps, that was the genesis of something deeper. Morning arrived like any other. I rose early, while Izzy still slept, prepared warm water and a simple breakfast for us both, allowing the sunlight to filter through the sheer curtains, bathing the apartment in a soft, golden light that gave it a semblance of warmth. Graham had already left, but he had left a note on the countertop. I'll be home early for lunch. Call if you need anything. I smiled at his handwriting, precise, almost rigid, as if it had been a long time since he had penned anything by hand. As I opened the door to collect the mail, a small box beside the entrance held a single envelope. No return address, no stamp, only my name scrawled in a stiff, unfamiliar hand. I tore it open right there in the hallway. Inside, a single photograph, and a line of chilling, printed text. The photo depicted me and Izzy. I was nursing her, head bowed, my arm wrapped protectively around her tiny back. The setting was the back pew of the church at Rachel's wedding. Beneath it, in stark letters, asterisk, you really think you're a mother? My hands turned to ice. A wave of fear washed over me. I whipped my head around, scanning the empty hallway, the silent elevator doors closing without a sound. I retreated inside, locking the door twice. Izzy was still asleep in her crib, blissfully unaware that something sinister had quietly invaded her small, safe world. I sank down, the photo clutched in my trembling fingers. It wasn't the fear of being seen, but the terror of someone choosing to watch, someone getting close enough to capture that private, sacred moment and weaponize it against me. I folded the photo, slipped it back into the envelope, and locked it in the drawer. Every instinct screamed at me to share this with Graham, but I needed time to process what was happening before I alarmed him. After breakfast, I carried Izzy up to the rooftop garden. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of dried leaves and the distant ocean, both invigorating and fragile. I held her close, my eyes searching every corner. Someone in the building could have done this, or someone who had been watching before, perhaps at the church. Why? And why me? I had nothing anyone would want. I didn't belong to Graham's world, but Izzy did, and I was the only person she trusted. When Graham returned at noon, I hesitated before handing him the envelope. He opened it at the kitchen counter, his face a mask. When his eyes landed on the photo, I saw the muscles in his jaw clench. Do you have any idea who might have done this? I asked, my voice low but steady. He remained silent for a long moment. Then he placed the photo down. It could be an old rival, or someone who believes I'm vulnerable because I've allowed someone into Izzy's life. So they targeted me. Not you, he corrected, his eyes hardening. Izzy, and you're the only person she trusts. My fists clenched. What are you going to do? Increase security, install more cameras, screen everyone entering the building. And what about me? If this continues, would you let me leave if that's what it takes to protect her? He turned to me then, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in his eyes. No, I'm not letting you go. Not when Izzy needs you this much. I fell silent. Part of me felt relief. Another part felt the first stirrings of dread. Not because of the letter itself, but because I knew, without any denial, that I had just stepped deeper into his world. A world made not only of strong emotions, but of hidden dangers I couldn't yet comprehend. And I wasn't sure I could ever retreat. 3 days after the anonymous letter, Graham returned home earlier than usual. His face drawn so tightly I didn't need to ask to know he had uncovered something serious. I was changing Izzy's diaper in the nursery when he walked in. His gray eyes were cold as ice, his shoulders trembling subtly even as he tried to keep his voice steady. "There's a man standing outside the building," he said, his grip on his phone so tight his knuckles were white. "He's been there since morning, staying until early afternoon. He hasn't come inside, hasn't caused any trouble, just stood across the street. But this is the 3rd time this week." I looked up at him, then down at Izzy, lying quietly in my arms, her tiny legs kicking softly, blissfully unaware of the turmoil in the world around her. "Did you check the cameras?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm even though my heart was racing. "Yes, security sent me zoomed-in images. The face is blurry, but it appears to be the same man. Tall, wearing a dark coat and a hat, never looking at the camera, but always positioned at the exact angle facing our apartment." I swallowed hard, lifting Izzy from the changing table and holding her close to my chest. For the first time since entering Graham's world, I felt a different kind of fear, not the grief of a mother who had lost a child, but the primal fear of losing again. "Who do you think is doing this? It could be Mateo's men or someone from the past. I'm not sure. But what I do know," he paused, his jaw tight, "it's not safe anymore." I sat down on the nearby chair, cradling Izzy against me, my hand gently patting her back out of instinct. She snuggled into me and drifted off to sleep, as if the world were still safe enough to surrender to dreams. "Do you want me to leave?" I asked, still looking at her small face rather than at him. Graham stepped closer and sat across from me. "No," he said firmly. "I want you and Izzy to be safe. If that means you need to leave this place, I'll arrange it." I finally met his gaze, not avoiding it for once. "If I leave, who will take care of her? Do you think there is another nanny who can make her sleep like this?" He was silent. "I'm not saying that to praise myself," I continued. "I'm saying it because I know Izzy. I feel her. Not just because I used to be a mother, but because I love her, and I'm not walking away when she needs me most." "But what if you get hurt?" His voice cracked, something breaking inside him. "I lost Julia. I can't lose anyone else." "I'm not Julia," I whispered. "And I don't abandon my child." The moment the words left my lips, the air between us seemed to freeze. He looked at me for a long time, his usually controlled gray eyes now reflecting emotions he could no longer conceal. "I'll stay," I said softly but clearly. "But I need to know everything, not just the surface. I need to understand the world you live in so I know how to protect her." He nodded slowly, as if sealing an unspoken agreement. "I'll tell you," he said. "But first we have to leave this place." I tightened my arms around Izzy. "Where?" "Vermont. A safe place. Quiet. Near the woods, a private house. No one knows about it." I drew a deep breath. A part of me screamed that I was stepping into a darkness I didn't know how to navigate. But another part, stronger, fiercer, reminded me that Izzy was in my arms, and the only thing I knew with certainty was that I couldn't leave her alone. If this was a battle I never chose, then I would still stay for her, for myself, and perhaps for the man looking at me with a vulnerability I had never seen in anyone. We left Boston on a cold October morning when the city was still shrouded in fog, the streets not yet fully awake. Graham drove, and I sat in the back seat beside Izzy, who slept soundly in the small bassinet I had carefully packed the night before with a thick, folded blanket. We didn't speak much on the drive. Only the hum of the tires on the damp asphalt and the soft whistle of wind slipping past the windows filled the car. Vermont emerged after nearly 5 hours of driving, feeling like an entirely different world. No horns, no bright lights, just long stretches of vibrant autumn maples, their leaves in shades of red, orange, and gold, rustling under the gentle fall breeze. Graham's house sat on a wide plot of land surrounded by tall pines and ancient oaks, with a wooden porch, a stone chimney, and wide windows overlooking a still lake behind it. It was unlike any place I had ever lived, but it held a quiet kind of peace that settled into my chest the moment I stepped inside. Graham opened the door, set down the suitcase, and led me through each room. Dark wood furniture, old, sturdy floors that creaked softly beneath our steps. The house wasn't large, but it felt warm, as though its walls had stored the heat of many winters gone by. My room was next to Izzy's, with a window overlooking the forest and an old bookshelf in the corner. I opened the curtains, letting in soft yellow sunlight that danced across the floor with the movement of the leaves outside. Izzy woke while I was unpacking, her eyes wide, blinking at the unfamiliar quiet. I picked her up, pressing my cheek to her soft forehead, her hair smelling faintly sweet warm, as if assuring her and me that everything was all right. The days that followed passed as slowly as the leaves falling outside the porch. We didn't turn on the television. We barely checked our phones. Graham spent more time with Izzy, learning to mix formula, change diapers, even rock her cradle when she fussed. I taught him how to sing to her, how to tell the difference between a hunger cry and a startled cry. He was clumsy at first, awkward in every small movement, but he improved quickly. One night, I awoke and walked into Izzy's room to find him sitting by the window, holding her against his chest while she slept. Moonlight spilled over his face, revealing a softness he usually tried to hide. I didn't speak. I simply watched, and for the first time in my life, my heart settled into a calm beat. We ate dinner together each night, cooking simple meals from vegetables in the garden, drinking ginger tea, talking about little things like the weather, the scent of pine, the hoot of an owl far off in the woods. Neither of us mentioned Boston, the photo, or the man outside the building. But in the quiet between conversations, we both understood that this was temporary. A needed pause to breathe, to live, to recover. And even knowing that, I found myself beginning to love this place. To love the way the wind sighed through the wooden joints of the house. To love the afternoon spent walking Izzy around the lake. To love the quiet seriousness of Graham as he listened to me tell old stories. Once, he stopped in the middle of the forest path, turned to me, and asked softly, "Have you ever thought about what makes a person feel truly safe?" I looked at Izzy sleeping in the stroller, then at him. "Yes, it's knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be at the exact moment you're meant to be there." He didn't reply. He only nodded slowly and thoughtfully, as if he had just found a missing piece of his own life's puzzle. And so had I. In the pale gold twilight of the Vermont autumn, for the first time since everything had happened, I realized I wasn't staying just for a child. I was staying for myself. That night, the cold arrived earlier than usual, the autumn wind carrying the damp scent of fallen leaves and the faint trace of wood smoke drifting from the small house by the forest. I had just finished putting Izzy to sleep when Graham tapped lightly on the doorframe, holding 2 steaming cups of tea. He wore a dark sweater, his hair tousled by the wind, his gaze carrying the gentle shadows of the woods behind the house. I stepped out, took the cup from him, and sat beside him on the long bench on the porch. The night was quiet, filled only with the rustle of leaves and the occasional sound of a wild creature somewhere in the forest. The sky stretched open above us, deep and dark, unspoiled by city lights. I lifted my eyes to the stars, drew in a slow breath, and felt my chest lighten in a way it hadn't in months. Graham sat still for a while before speaking, his voice low, roughened slightly by the cold. He asked if I had ever felt as though time had paused, as if a single moment could reveal an entire story about someone. I turned to look at him, surprised by the question. But when I met his eyes, I realized it wasn't a philosophical musing. It was a quiet confession. I nodded. There are moments that don't need reason or explanation. They simply happen and they change us. We sat in silence a bit longer, and when his gaze found mine again, something shifted between us. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just the quiet dissolving of an invisible distance we had both pretended not to notice. He reached out and brushed his fingers against mine, his skin warmer than I expected. I didn't pull away. Instead, I took his hand, and we sat that way for a long time, our fingers intertwined as though we had both found a place to belong. When I finally rose to return inside, he followed. I didn't speak and he didn't need to ask. Everything had already been said in the silence and in the things we hadn't named. In the small room scented with pine and warm tea, I turned to face him. Graham reached up and brushed his hand through my hair, his palm steady and impossibly warm. The first kiss was soft, almost cautious, as though we were both afraid of breaking the fragile moment resting between our hearts. But the second kiss and the third came deeper, slower, making time itself seem to hold its breath. We weren't rushing. We weren't trying to prove anything. We were just 2 people far too familiar with loss, finally finding a place to pause, to touch life and love again in the gentlest way. Graham held me as though he feared I might disappear, and I leaned into him as though my center of gravity had at last returned after months of drifting. No words were spoken that night, only breath, heartbeats, and the meaningful silence of 2 people learning to trust again. Afterward, we lay side by side, his arm draped across me, my ear resting above the steady rhythm of his heart. Outside, the wind still moved through the trees, but inside this room, I knew fear no longer lived in me, not fear of the past, not fear of loss, because for the first time since Lily left, I felt alive again, truly alive. And Graham, though he made no promises, though he spoke no vows, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. He was opening his heart, slowly and deliberately, making space for me in his world. Not just because of Izzy, but because of me. That night wasn't a night of fleeting passion. It was a beginning of forgiveness, of healing, and of a love neither of us believed we would ever have again. We returned to Boston on a gray morning, the city still half asleep, the damp streets reflecting the faded glow of streetlights. The armored SUV wound into the underground parking garage, the security checks more thorough than ever. Graham said nothing during the entire drive, his hand tightening around the steering wheel as though holding back something threatening to break loose. Izzy slept peacefully in my arms, completely unaware that the world around her had shifted once again. The tall building that had once felt cold no longer intimidated me, but the atmosphere inside had changed. I felt it the moment we stepped in, a suffocating hush, a tension in the air as though everything was bracing for something terrible. Breakfast had been prepared, but no one touched it. Graham was on the phone nonstop, moving in and out of his office, speaking with men in suits whose faces were carved from stone. I didn't need to ask to know something had happened. Late that afternoon, after I had settled Izzy down for a nap and was tidying the bags, Graham entered the room holding a thick envelope. He handed it to me, his eyes fixed on my face, unblinking. Inside were photographs of me, at the park, at the store, but there was one that made my blood run cold. A grainy, long-range shot of me standing on the private terrace, holding Izzy. They didn't need noise to plant fear. "This is Mateo," Graham said quietly, his eyes darkening. "He wants me to withdraw from the merger with the Langston Group, and he knows Izzy is my weakness." "Did you call the police?" I asked, fighting to steady my voice. "There's nothing concrete to accuse him with. Mateo is smart. He's playing psychological games. He knows I won't gamble with this." I set the photos down, my hand curling into a tight fist. "So what are you going to do?" Graham was silent for a long time before exhaling a heavy breath, one I had never heard from him before. "I don't know," he admitted. "Every option has risks. I can strengthen security, but if he truly wants to act, no one is safe." I looked down at Izzy, sleeping in her bassinet, her tiny hand curled loosely around the edge of her blanket. Her face was peaceful, innocent, unaware that someone out there saw her as a chess piece in a dangerous game. "We can't let him use her as a tool," I whispered, my eyes fixed on her. "I know," Graham said, and for the first time he looked powerless. Not from lack of money or authority, but because this time the threat wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed at the people he loved. We both understood this was no longer just business. This was personal. A strike aimed directly at what was sacred, family. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat beside Izzy's crib, listening to her steady breaths, my mind tangled with the weight of memory and fear. I had once lost a child because I couldn't protect her. I would not let it happen again, no matter what. And in the dark, when Graham came and sat beside me, silently taking my hand, I knew we were standing together at a line we could never step back from. If Mateo thought he could make us afraid, he was wrong, because for the first time in my life I wasn't clinging to loss. I had something worth fighting for, and I wasn't fighting alone. A week after Mateo's subtle threats, Graham decided to take me to the annual gathering of the most influential families in Boston's business world, where men in three-piece suits and women in expensive evening gowns exchanged not only glasses of champagne, but also handshakes laced with silent power bargains. I wore the high-necked black dress Graham had arranged for me, my hair neatly pinned up, my makeup subtle enough to look polished without drawing attention. The moment we stepped into the grand ballroom, A wave of opulent energy washed over me. In the hallowed hall of the historic hotel on Beacon Hill, every eye seemed to pivot in our direction. It wasn't my presence that commanded such attention. I was, after all, just Claire. No, their gazes were drawn to the man beside me, Graham Whitmore. The name whispered with a mixture of envy and speculation. Everyone knew Mateo had designs on him, and I was simply the latest woman they perceived as his weakness, a chink in his armor. Graham, ever perceptive, gave my hand a reassuring squeeze before excusing himself to greet a few trusted associates, leaving me stranded amidst a circle of women whose smiles were as brittle as spun sugar and whose eyes held the glacial chill of the marble floor beneath our feet. "You must be Claire, the nanny?" one of them purred, a platinum blonde with a voice that could strip the varnish off a table. Her smile was a mere sliver, a fleeting expression that failed to reach her eyes. I met her gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I take care of Izzy," I replied simply, letting the words hang in the air, daring her to diminish my role. She emitted a soft, amused breath, the sound laced with condescension. "How sweet. Women like you rarely last long in this world. Everything here has its own rules, you see. Rules not written on paper, but measured in loyalty and in the price you pay when you trust the wrong person." The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. This was their world, and I was an interloper. Before I could formulate a response, a man stepped forward, placing his glass of amber liquid on a nearby table. His eyes, dark and assessing, lingered on me for a moment before turning to the blonde. There was a subtle warning in his gaze. Asterisk, does she know that Whitmore once had another woman slip in from the side door just like her and then disappear without a trace? I met his stare without flinching, my voice steady and clear. "I didn't know," I stated plainly, "and I don't care. Graham's past is his. The present is why I'm here, because of his daughter. And if anyone thinks they can scare me with vague warnings, then they've underestimated the wrong person." The words hung in the air, a defiant challenge to their established order. No one replied immediately, but I saw the subtle shift in their expressions. The mockery receded, replaced by a calculating assessment. I had refused to be intimidated, and that, it seemed, had earned me a modicum of respect. Graham returned at that moment, his hand instinctively finding the small of my back in a protective gesture. His eyes swept across the faces of those who had tried to corner me, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw the only indication of his displeasure. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice steady, but edged with an undercurrent of tension. "Nothing at all," I answered quickly, cutting off any potential escalation. "We were just talking about loyalty, an interesting subject." He looked at me for a long, searching moment, then nodded slowly. He understood the unspoken language, the veiled threats, the power dynamics at play. The party continued, the murmur of conversations swirling around the room. But I knew something had irrevocably changed. My presence was no longer a mere curiosity. It was a test, and I had, against all odds, passed it. Later that evening, back in the hushed stillness of the apartment, Izzy was fast asleep, her small face serene, oblivious to the undercurrents of the world outside. Graham stood by the window, the city lights twinkling below like fallen stars. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but instead of drinking, he merely swirled the amber liquid slowly in the glass. "I didn't mean for you to deal with that," he said quietly, his voice laced with a hint of regret. "They're testing you. And me." I walked over to him, my movements deliberate and calming. I gently took the glass from his hand and set it down on the table. "They can say whatever they want," I said, meeting his gaze. "What matters is that you trust me." He held my gaze longer than usual, as if he were taking stock of the burgeoning faith that was growing between us. "I do," he said finally, his voice low and resonant. "And that's what frightens them." In a world where a handshake could ignite a cold war and a smile could mask a declaration of battle, I understood clearly that I had stepped into a realm not meant for the faint of heart. But if I had to choose someone to stand beside in a room full of lies, I would still choose Graham. Not because of his power or influence, but because he had opened a circle he once guarded fiercely and allowed me inside. And to me, that gesture meant more than any ring or contract ever could. The morning after the party, a private invitation arrived for Graham, extended by one of the old families, a group renowned for maintaining neutrality amidst the escalating tensions between him and Mateo. Instead of attending alone, he turned to me, his eyes holding a silent question. "Do you want to join me?" "Yes," I replied without hesitation. We arrived at a historic mansion nestled along the Charles River, its ivy-covered walls and the crisp morning air carrying the distinct scent of an old Boston, a city that was elegant, quiet, and yet deeply dangerous beneath every watchful eye. Inside, 6 older men sat around a massive round oak table, each representing a different branch of hidden influence within the city's intricate business underworld. They didn't offer smiles upon my entrance, but neither did they attempt to stop me. Graham, with a subtle act of defiance, pulled out a chair for me. Such a small gesture, yet it was met with a palpable pause in the room, a collective intake of breath. The air crackled with unspoken tension. The conversation quickly turned tense, focusing on the imbalance Mateo had created after Graham publicly aligned himself with the Langston Group and refused Mateo's proposals for dishonest profit sharing. Then one of the men turned to me, his voice a low, gravelly rumble like the sound of fire crackling in a hearth. "What do you think of Graham's decision? Wise or reckless?" I didn't look away, didn't flinch under his scrutiny. "I think it's the necessary choice," I stated with unwavering conviction. A father cannot allow his child to grow up in a world where money outweighs morality. And if his choice inconveniences someone, then perhaps we should ask what exactly that inconvenience was protecting. The room fell silent, every eye fixed upon me. Then, a woman, Helen Russo, the only female present and a broker of major deals for over 2 decades, deliberately set her cup down on the table with a soft thud and nodded her head in slow agreement. "She's right," she said, her voice carrying the weight of her years. "We forget that stability cannot come from fear alone." Another man gave a small, almost imperceptible laugh, not mocking, but as though he had just witnessed something truly unexpected, something that had shifted his perspective. Graham looked at me, a flicker of surprise mingled with pride illuminating his features. When the meeting concluded and we walked out, no one shook Graham's hand with the same effusive familiarity they once had. Instead, they began offering short, measured nods in my direction. Cautious acknowledgments, respectful, even wary. On the drive back, Graham remained quiet for a long time, lost in thought. Finally he spoke, his voice subdued. They won't openly support me, he said. But they'll stop siding with Mateo, and that's enough to shift the balance. I turned to him, a faint smile gracing my lips. You changed your approach without even noticing. You didn't choose to fire back, to retaliate. You chose to talk. And they finally started listening. He exhaled, a release of something heavy he had carried for far too long. You made them reconsider, he admitted, his voice tinged with wonder. You weren't afraid of being dragged into a game outsiders aren't meant to play. You made them see the human side, not just the power struggle. I squeezed his hand gently, my touch conveying more than words ever could. Because I know what I'm protecting, I said softly. Not just you, Izzy too. She deserves a world not stained with blood or retaliation. That evening, Graham prepared a small, intimate dinner at the apartment. No security staff, no assistants, just him, me, and Izzy. We ate simple pasta he cooked himself, while Izzy sat in her high chair, tapping her spoon against the plastic tray like a tiny warrior who had just won her first battle. Neither of us spoke the words aloud, but both of us felt it clearly. The storm was beginning to pass. Not because everything was suddenly safe, but because we were no longer fighting the old way. My presence, the way I stood up to those forces with calm, with carefully chosen words, with unwavering resolve, had opened a new path for Graham. And he, instead of resorting to shortcuts and shadows, chose to stand steady, to act with integrity. In the warm glow of the dining room, I saw something in Graham's face that he once believed he could never have. A family that didn't need to be perfect, only brave and willing to believe in one another. 3 days after that peaceful dinner, Graham received word that Mateo was planning a private meeting with 2 allied families at a secluded estate outside the city. It was his chance to claw back the power he had been steadily losing ever since the neutral families began quietly distancing themselves. But what worried us more, what sent a shiver of ice down my spine, was that among the intercepted calls the security team uncovered, there was a short audio clip where my name and Izzy's were mentioned, the tone so cold and devoid of humanity it made something inside me sink. Graham didn't panic. He sat down with his 3 closest associates and a legal advisor, a team he trusted implicitly. Together, they meticulously mapped out every financial vein Mateo used to keep his influence alive, to grease the wheels of his empire. None of us wanted bloodshed. I knew Graham had handled things differently in the past, relying on brute force and intimidation. But this time, with me and Izzy in the middle of it, he chose a strategy that aimed to strip Mateo of the one thing he valued above all else. Control. Graham's plan was terrifyingly simple, but it required a gamble so dangerous that his legal advisor turned pale when he heard it. Graham decided to open the gates, to lower the drawbridge and invite the enemy inside. He instructed his team to stop defending the company's stock price, allowing it to plummet artificially for a period of 24 hours. It was the perfect bait, a siren song to Mateo's insatiable greed. Mateo, arrogant and smelling blood, did exactly what Graham predicted. He liquidated his safe assets, emptied his coffers, and leveraged everything he had to short sell Graham's company, hoping to deliver a fatal blow and seize the empire at a bargain price. I watched Graham pace the living room that entire day, his movements restless and controlled. His phone remained silent, his eyes fixed on the ticking clock, each second stretching into an eternity. He was risking his life's work, everything he had built. If Mateo didn't take the bait, Graham stood to lose nearly half his fortune, potentially crippling his empire. But Graham didn't flinch. He was betting on Mateo's hubris, his insatiable appetite for power. Then, at precisely 4 p.m., the trap snapped shut. The net closed with ruthless precision. Graham didn't just defend his stock. He revealed his ace, the card he had been holding close to his chest. Through a complex network of proxy firms, Graham had quietly purchased the very bank loans Mateo was using to fund his attack. In an instant, the tables turned. The predator had become the prey. Graham wasn't just his rival anymore. He was his creditor and he called in the debt. Immediate repayment, the full sum. No loopholes, no delays. Mateo was caught in a financial vice grip, squeezed beyond the point of escape. He had no liquid assets left, no reserves to draw upon. He had thrown everything, his entire fortune, into the ill-fated attack. Graham held the power to seize Mateo's personal estates, his offshore accounts, everything he owned. Within hours, the hunter had become the hunted. I wasn't present during those tense negotiations, but the night he came home, I knew the outcome before he even uttered a word. Graham stepped inside the apartment, removed his coat, hung it on the rack with unusual care, and then pulled me into a long, steady embrace. He didn't have to say anything. I felt the relief in the rise and fall of his breath, the tension that had been etched into his muscles slowly dissolving. Izzy slept soundly in the next room, her small body relaxed, unaware that her life had just been safeguarded by quiet, deliberate moves, by a battle fought not with guns and violence, but with intellect and strategic brilliance. The next morning, Mateo officially withdrew from the Langston Group deal, citing vague, personal reasons and unstable financial circumstances. No one publicly spoke of what had transpired behind the scenes, but everyone in Boston's shadowy financial circles understood the truth. Graham had won. There was no gunfire, no bodies left in the street, only the silent collapse of a man who had once commanded fear and wielded power with ruthless abandon. Later that afternoon, Graham and I sat on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the Boston rooftops with strokes of gold. Izzy crawled on the floor beside us, happily engrossed in playing with the stuffed toy I'd sewn for her during our days in Vermont. A simple creation that had become her most treasured possession. I rested my head on Graham's shoulder, silent for a long moment before whispering that he had done it all for us. He turned, gently kissed my forehead, and said it as though it were the simplest, most undeniable truth in the world. Because the two of you are my family. It was the first time he had said it so plainly, without hesitation, without the shield of metaphor. I didn't answer, only tightened my hand around his, letting him know that I had heard him, that I believed him, and that I would stand by him, always. Not every story needs a dramatic ending, a violent crescendo. Some conflicts are resolved not with bloodshed, but with intelligence, patience, and the conscious decision not to succumb to the darkest impulses within ourselves. Graham had once lived by the laws of force, by the code of the underworld, but now he lived to protect something stronger, something more profound. Love. And I, a woman who once thought she had lost everything, found that I had gained more than I had ever imagined, more than I ever dared to hope for. I officially moved in with Graham and Izzy on a crisp winter morning. the city still half asleep under a veil of fog. Bare tree branches etched quiet, skeletal shapes onto the cold, wet pavement, stark reminders of the season's stark beauty. There was no grand ceremony, no public announcement, just a quiet, certain decision, as if everything we had been through together had carved its own vow, a commitment deeper and more enduring than anything spoken aloud. Graham's apartment slowly, organically, transformed into a home. I replaced the heavy, somber curtains with soft cream ones, letting the sunlight stream in. I traded the once cold and sterile palette for warmer, more inviting tones, filling the space with colors that reflected the love that bloomed within. I added small pots of herbs near the kitchen window, mint and rosemary, their fragrant scents permeating each meal we cooked together, adding a touch of warmth and domesticity. The living room, once a showcase of wealth and power, no longer felt like a museum. It echoed daily with Izzy's soft babbling and the rhythmic tapping of her tiny hands as she explored her world on her hands and knees. She laughed uncontrollably when Graham lay on the floor, pretending to be a fearsome monster, letting her defeat him with nothing more than a gummy grin and a delighted shriek. One afternoon, while I was washing vegetables in the kitchen, preparing dinner, I heard Graham call my name, his voice filled with a tone of pure wonder. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and hurried out to the living room, my heart quickening with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. I found Izzy pulling herself up to stand against Graham's knee, her tiny legs wobbly and unsure, but her face radiant with pure triumph. For the first time, she was standing on her own, reaching for the world with newfound confidence. Graham sat cross-legged on the floor, his arms wide open, his eyes gleaming with unadulterated joy. I knelt beside him, wrapping my arms around them both, feeling our 3 heartbeats aligning in that small, sunlit room. Those were no longer days of merely surviving the shadows, of clinging to hope in the face of despair. They were days of learning to truly live again, of embracing the light and finding joy in the simplest moments. I saw renewal in the way Graham lifted Izzy into the air, spinning her around until she giggled uncontrollably before showering her soft cheek with kisses. I saw it in the way he looked at me whenever I laughed too loudly or dropped something out of sheer clumsiness, his eyes filled with an affection that transcended words. He was no longer the guarded man hiding behind walls of silence and steel. He had opened the door, and I, along with Izzy, were the first to step inside without having to knock, without having to ask permission. Mornings were gentler, infused with a sense of peace and contentment. We ate breakfast bathed in sunlight, Graham meticulously making coffee while I fed Izzy her cereal. She banged her tiny hands on the tray each time she waited for another spoonful, emitting a series of babbling sounds that only she understood, a secret language shared only between herself and the universe. Graham would glance over at me with a soft smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and admit that he never thought he would long for the sound of a child's laughter each morning, that he had resigned himself to a life of quiet solitude. I never thought I would feel this way again, either. I would reply, my voice thick with emotion, the feeling of being needed, not just as a caretaker, but as an essential thread in the fabric of a family unlike any model I'd ever imagined, yet perfectly aligned with my heart in the most unexpected and profound way. Nights were no longer heavy with the weight of unspoken fears and unresolved conflicts. Graham no longer stayed awake, staring out the window at the city lights, carrying the weight of the world on his broad shoulders. He slept peacefully, his arm draped possessively around me, and I felt held by something greater than mere love. Trust, unwavering and unconditional. And Izzy, once only able to find solace and sleep in my arms, now rested soundly in her crib, clutching her beloved stuffed bear, sometimes reaching for her familiar blanket, her small face serene and untroubled. I knew that she too sensed that something fundamental had shifted, that she was surrounded by safety, warmth, and the feeling of having a real home. One quiet weekend afternoon, while we were organizing the bedroom closet, attempting to bring order to the chaos, Graham pulled down an old box from the highest shelf, its cardboard worn and faded with age. Inside were photographs, small keepsakes, and a framed picture of Julia, Izzy's mother. He handed it to me without a word, his eyes tinged with sadness, but devoid of any regret. He was entrusting me with a piece of his past, a part of his heart. I held the frame gently, looked at her image for a long moment, and then nodded slowly, offering a silent acknowledgement, a gesture of respect and understanding. Thank you, I whispered, as if offering silent gratitude to the woman who had brought Izzy into the world, who had been a part of Graham's life before me. Graham wrapped his arms around me from behind, holding me close, his chin resting on the top of my head. No past is perfect, he said, his voice low and resonant. But if we are brave enough to walk through it, the present can become something extraordinary. And I knew, deep in my bones, that we had begun to build that extraordinary thing, day by day, hour by hour, through the simplest of moments, with a love that needed no grand display, only truth and unwavering commitment. From the other room, Izzy laughed, a bright, ringing sound like an echo of new life, reminding us that hope always finds a place to root itself, as long as there is somewhere warm enough, somewhere loving enough, to receive it. That morning began like any other ordinary day, with Izzy squealing with delight in the bedroom as Graham kissed her tiny belly, making her laugh in that breathless, irresistible way that only babies can, a sound that filled the apartment with warmth and joy. I stood in the kitchen, gently stirring eggs in a pan, letting that familiar sound echo through the apartment like the soundtrack of mornings, warmed by sunlight and tenderness. Graham stepped out of the bedroom carrying Izzy, her little hands having left streaks of drool across his shirt, as if she were marking her territory, claiming him as her own. I laughed, my heart swelling with affection, and he glanced over, smiling back at me, though something in his eyes was quieter than usual, something deeper beneath the familiar softness. We ate breakfast as we always did, savoring the simple pleasure of being together. But when we finished cleaning up, Graham suddenly told me to dress warmly, his tone laced with an undercurrent of excitement. He wanted to take me somewhere, he said. I was surprised by the unexpected plan, but I obliged without question, trusting his instincts and eager for whatever adventure awaited us. We dropped Izzy off with Mary, our new nanny, whom I had carefully trained and trusted implicitly, and then Graham drove us to a small, secluded beach north of the city, a place once bustling with locals during the summer months, but now silent and deserted in the gentle cold of late winter. The wind skimmed lightly over the water, the waves rolling in soft, rhythmic ripples under the pale sunlight. The sand was still damp and cold beneath our feet, but the chill was invigorating, a welcome contrast to the warmth of the car. We walked slowly along the shore, not speaking much, simply holding hands, our fingers intertwined. We stepped over the fading footprints of someone who had walked there before us, as though we were continuing a story that had begun long before this moment, a narrative stretching back through time. Near a large rock jutting from the sand, a sentinel guarding the coastline, Graham stopped and stared out at the ocean for a long time, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken emotions, with the weight of shared experiences. Then, he turned to me, and his gray eyes reflected the vast expanse of the open sky, the boundless possibilities that stretched before us. He didn't kneel. There was no glittering ring presented with a flourish, no crowd bearing witness to the spectacle. There was only the rhythm of the waves crashing against the shore, the cry of seagulls overhead, and the pounding of my own heart, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. He spoke softly, almost a whisper, his voice carried away by the gentle breeze. Yet I heard every word as if they were etched directly into my soul, imprinted on my very being. He said that he had no grand speech prepared, no carefully rehearsed soliloquy filled with empty promises. He couldn't promise me a life without hardship, without challenges, without moments of doubt and fear. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty, a truth that resonated deep within his heart. From the moment I stepped into his life, everything began shifting in the right direction. That I didn't just bring life back to Izzy, filling her world with laughter and love, but that I had also returned to him something he thought he had lost forever. The feeling of belonging, the sense of having a home, a safe haven from the storms of the world. That every morning he woke beside me, he felt a sense of peace and contentment he had never known before. And every time he saw me hold his daughter with the tenderness and unwavering love of a mother, he knew that if anyone was strong enough, gentle enough, steady enough to build a future with him, to navigate the complexities of life together, it was me. And then he asked, his voice strained with emotion, if I would be willing to build the rest of my life with him, not as a temporary companion, not as a fleeting infatuation, but as his wife, as Izzy's mother, and as the home that we could be to each other, a sanctuary where we could always find solace and strength. I didn't need to weigh the pros and cons, to analyze the risks and rewards. My heart answered before my lips could even form the words. I nodded, tears streaming down my face, tears of joy and relief and overwhelming gratitude, filled with a feeling I once believed I would never reclaim. The feeling of being chosen, of being loved unconditionally, and of being trusted without reservation. Yes, I whispered, my voice choked with emotion, and Graham pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as if making sure I was real, not a figment of his imagination, not a dream he might wake from and find himself alone again. We stood together in the sea breeze, surrounded by a landscape so quiet and simple, yet more sacred than any church or castle. It wasn't a proposal crafted to impress, to win over the affections of a reluctant bride, but it was the truest, most authentic proposal I had ever received from a man who once lived in the shadows, who had built his life on secrets and deceit, yet chose the light because of me and his daughter, because he finally understood that love was the most powerful force in the world. When we returned home, Izzy squealed with delight the moment she saw us, reaching out to me with her chubby little arms, as though she too wanted to witness and celebrate that precious moment, to be a part of our joy. I lifted her into my arms, kissed her soft cheek, and Graham wrapped his arms around both of us, his expression needing no words to reveal the happiness swelling inside him, the profound sense of contentment that had finally settled in his soul. This family, our family, had finally found one another, not by chance or circumstance, but by choice, a conscious decision made every single day to love, to cherish, and to protect one another. We held our wedding on an early spring afternoon, when Boston's sky was clear and the sunlight brushed softly against the old rooftops below, casting a golden glow over the city. The rooftop of our building was decorated simply but warmly, with colorful fresh flowers spilling from rustic vases, white chairs draped in sheer fabric swaying gently in the breeze, and a wooden arch adorned with sprigs of lavender, the same lavender I had once grown in small pots on our balcony, a symbol of hope and new beginnings. Graham chose this place because it was where the three of us had first watched the sunset together, where he had told me, in a moment of unguarded vulnerability, that I had become his home, the place where he finally felt safe and at peace. We didn't want a grand, ostentatious wedding, a lavish display of wealth and power. We only wanted the people who truly mattered, the ones who had stood by us through thick and thin, who had witnessed our struggles and celebrated our triumphs. Rachel, my closest friend, who had held my hand through the darkest days when I lost my child, now stood beside me again, her eyes shimmering with tears even as she smiled, her heart overflowing with happiness for me. Mary stood in the front row holding Izzy, who wore a tiny white lace dress and a delicate crown of baby's breath. Her face lit up with excitement as she babbled at the sight of so many people, her tiny hands waving in the air. There was also Mrs. Helen Russo, the woman who had once witnessed me face down powerful men in a fateful boardroom meeting, the woman who had seen my strength and resolve. She now watched me with a rare tenderness and trust, her eyes reflecting the respect she had for the woman I had become. Graham waited beneath the wooden arch, his light gray suit making him look both strong and gentle, a man who had learned to balance power with compassion. When I walked toward him, hand in hand with Rachel, the rug held Izzy, curled in the sweet slumber of childhood, her faithful stuffed bear nestled beside her. I stirred, drawn awake by a delicate sound drifting from the kitchen, where Graham was busy coaxing coffee to life. The comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee danced with the inviting scent of toast, painting the apartment with the unmistakable feeling of a true sanctuary, a place to belong. Nothing overtly remarkable occurred that morning, yet it was precisely that gentle rhythm of the ordinary that felt profoundly miraculous. I drifted into the living room, settling beside Graham, leaning my head against the familiar comfort of his shoulder, his arms instinctively wrapped around me, a gesture worn smooth by love and time, a reassurance that never once faltered. Outside, the city was beginning to stretch and yawn, the low thrum of traffic gradually weaving its way into the cool morning air. But within the walls of our apartment, everything remained cocooned in a rare and precious quiet, a haven from the burgeoning day. After a while, Izzy's eyes fluttered open, her small hands rubbing away the remnants of sleep. A wide, unrestrained grin bloomed across her face as she spotted us sitting there, waiting for her as if it were an age-old ritual, a cherished tradition etched into the very fabric of our small family. I gently lifted her into my arms, feeling the soft, steady rhythm of her tiny heartbeat against my chest, a warmth and peace that washed over me like a wave. In that singular moment, Bathed in the pale morning light, a profound understanding settled within me. Every pain I had ever endured, every heart-wrenching loss, every whisper of doubt and fear, had somehow impossibly led me here, to this place. A place that was so much more than just a beautifully appointed apartment. It was a sanctuary for the soul, a space to breathe freely, to live authentically, to be loved unconditionally, without the burden of having to become someone else. A place where I could simply be myself. A mother, a wife, a woman who had once stumbled and fallen, but who had risen again, stronger and wiser, standing on the solid ground of trust and enduring love. Graham carefully set down his coffee mug and turned to gaze at Izzy and me, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he offered a quiet, grateful smile. No words were necessary. Everything that truly needed to be said was already present, woven into the tapestry of our actions, our gestures, our shared silences. In mornings like this, where no grand gestures or dazzling displays of magic were required for life to feel utterly miraculous, our story didn't begin with a fairy tale vision of perfection, but rather with fractures, with cracks in the foundation. And yet, it was through those very fractures that light managed to seep in, illuminating the hidden corners and nurturing new growth. And from that light, a new life took shape, a life richer and more vibrant than we could have ever imagined. If you've stayed with us until this final moment, we sincerely hope that something within this journey has resonated with your own heart. Perhaps it sparked a flicker of courage to begin again, a renewed belief in the healing power of love, or simply offered the gentle warmth of witnessing a family navigate the complexities of life and find their way back to each other amidst the inevitable chaos. How did the story make you feel? Did anything remind you of your own experiences, your own struggles, your own triumphs? We would be deeply grateful to hear your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. Share what's in your heart, your own unique narrative. You never know. Your story might be the next one to ignite inspiration in the hearts of thousands of others. And if this journey felt meaningful to you, please consider giving this video a like. Share it with someone you care about, someone who might need a little bit of light and hope in their day. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can continue walking alongside us through stories filled with raw emotion, undeniable humanity, and unwavering truth every single day. Thank you, from the bottom of our hearts, for listening with your whole being. Wishing you abundant good health, a life filled with profound peace, and gentle days overflowing with quiet joy. Goodbye for now, and we'll eagerly anticipate seeing you in the next chapter of our journey.